So first of all, we look at the call to the world, then we'll look at the conflict in the world at the time, and we'll also cover some other parts about that conflict and look to the future and look to other parts of Daniel a little bit. Then we'll look at Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego and see their camaraderie, their confidence and their confession all seem to be C's today, and it just works out that way. And then we'll look at the actual command of execution, and then the comfort that Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego actually had during that time of the execution. Or the supposed execution, which we found out about. It wasn't an execution, but it was an attempted execution. Now, as far as the call to the world to conform, this came out from King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar was a tyrant, as we've learnt so far, and if you came to him early morning and he was grumpy, you'd have to be very careful what you said, because you would lose your head very quickly if you said the wrong thing to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, in the previous chapter, remember, we saw Nebuchadnezzar have this dream about this figure that was made up into four parts: the gold, silver, bronze, and then the iron, and then iron mixed with clay. And remember, Daniel interpreted the dream for Nebuchadnezzar, and he said, "You are the head. You are the gold head. You are the head of the whole figure. You are the start of the whole figure in the history of mankind and in the picture that God represented to King Nebuchadnezzar." So Nebuchadnezzar somehow thinks that he's really important, and so important that he comes to this time a little bit later on and decides to make an image of himself and to make it out of gold. But not only to make the image, but to say that everyone needed to come and worship that image, the image of himself. And he wanted conformity in worship. He wanted everyone to come and worship that God which he had created, the image of himself, so that everyone, now we know that everyone in the known world in that time was to come and worship this image. And we have it right here, in verse 2. King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather. He gathered all the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the councillors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and everyone else. And he told the whole world and put out a decree to the whole world for them to come and worship the image. This is really the start of conformity to the worship of something which is other than God. Right from the time when the Tower of Babel had commenced, there was a man called Nimrod that actually had a call out to the people of the world to come and worship, not himself, but to worship images and to take away their worship from God who is in heaven to the images and the idols that they made. From the very beginning of Babel to the time of Babylon, and then right through the whole history, which we find out in the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, is that Satan is all about the worship of himself and distracting other people from the worship of God to the worship of Satan and worship of anything other than God. So there's the call to conform, the call to worship that which is other than God. Remember when Satan appeared to Jesus in the wilderness and took him to a high mountain and tempted him to worship Satan. Remember what he did. He showed Jesus all the glories of the world. In a snapshot, probably. I don't know how long this happened over. But there Satan was able to show Jesus all the glories of the world. Maybe the glories of communication, the glories of computer, the glories of the internet, the glories of the buildings that we've made in the history of mankind, the glory of our governments, the glory of the wars and the wonderful things that have happened in the world throughout history. The glories, well, the supposed glories. But here Satan is showing Jesus the glories of the world and putting them before him, and then he says, if you worship me, you will have all of these things, all of these glories. But Jesus said, you shall worship the Lord, and him only shall you worship. And he was thinking of the glories to come. He wasn't thinking of the glories of the world, because he knew the glories of the world would end up in nothing. But what Satan wanted was Jesus to fall down and worship him, to worship that which is other than God. When we come to this part of the passage, in the first few verses, we realise that this image was really something that goes right through the book of Daniel, and we'll pick this up, this image, right through the book of Daniel and right through to the book of Revelation in Revelation chapter 13. And if you actually turn to Revelation 13, I'll just quickly read out some verses. I saw a beast rising out of the sea, and 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its head. And the beast that I saw was a leopard, like a leopard. Its feet were like bears, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. And the whole earth marvelled as they followed the beast, and they worshipped the dragon. The dragon is Satan, for he had given his authority to the beast. He had given his authority, as Satan has given his authority to the beast, and that the world would worship the beast. He sets up an unholy trinity. He tries to replicate what God has done in setting up himself as the Father and the Son. And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. And going on to verse 8, and all who dwell on the earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world of the book of life, or the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. So even wrapping up right through to the end of history, we have the worship of something other than God, and the whole world seems to conform to that worship. And only those who have their names in the book of life will not worship the beast, will not worship the image of the beast or the beast himself, which is Satan. So we have some tie-ups here. We have an idol that is made to the height of 60 cubits by 6. Remember in the book of Revelation we have the message that this man is represented with the number 666. And whoever has ears to hear, whoever has understanding, let him understand. We have a precursor of something that is to come. And we know 6 is the number which is imperfect. We know Satan is certainly imperfect. 7 is the perfect number, but 6 here is represented as something that is imperfect. And an image of something is always imperfect, except for Christ himself, who is the express image of the Father. So we have that call to worship. When I come to this passage, I'm reminded that martyrdom and the history of martyrdom in the church is a present reality. It's a present reality in the church. I went yesterday to a retreat. It's an IOM retreat, which is International Outreach Ministries, iom.org.au, if ever you want to look it up. And we're involved in some work in India, in Andhra Pradesh, the Western Godavari area, and also in Orissa. We have 5 pastors that we support and pray for in Orissa. I went to Andhra Pradesh a few years ago, and I was asked to speak at a church. It was a little church in the middle of nowhere. It seemed to be in the middle of nowhere in Andhra Pradesh. And Sam came along with me. He's my eldest son. And we were asked to speak at the church. But before we spoke at the church, the pastor was speaking to us. His name was John. He said he had fantastic English skills, but we couldn't understand what he was saying. We had to get him to repeat it all the time. But he was telling us the story of his daughter who wants to go and work in Orissa and preach the gospel in Orissa. And she was saying that through her father, who spoke English, she didn't speak English, but she was saying that she was inspired by the martyrdom of Graham Staines. So if you could bring that picture up. Graham Staines with his son Philip and Timothy were martyred in 1991. Don't know whether I've got that date. Yeah, January 23rd, 1999, sorry. Not 91. And she was inspired by the story of Graham and his 2 sons and the daughter Esther. Now the daughter Esther didn't die, but she was encouraged by Esther and the mother, who have actually gone back to the area. She's actually trained up to be a doctor and is working back in the area, and her mother's been working back in the area where her husband died. She was encouraged by this martyrdom, and she now wants to go and preach the gospel and be martyred for the Lord in Orissa. And Orissa is a very, very dangerous place. The pastors are still getting persecuted, still getting their heads chopped off, still getting all their goods and furniture taken away and houses burned and all sorts of things happening. But I remember flicking channels, as I often do sometimes. My kids know I flick channels sometimes. And I flicked it to ABC just on the day after Graham Staines was martyred, and I saw Esther Staines speaking on the telly. And she said these words. She said, and she had sort of little tears just about trickling down, just about to trickle out of her eyes, but she was holding herself up well. And she said, I praise God that he found my father worthy to die for Christ. And I tell you what, that had an impact on me too. And I had tears streaming down my eyes at that stage when I heard that. I thought, what a beautiful story. Here was a girl who just lost her father and her two brothers in a terrible catastrophe when some Hindu worshippers came and burnt them alive in their jeep. And she could just say, praise God that he was found worthy. He was found worthy. So it's, this story that we come to here is not something of the past. It's something that is a present reality. It's something that is happening out in the mission fields. It's happening around the world today. People being martyred for the Lord. If you like, flip to the next one too. Thanks. Well, actually, flick back one. Sorry. Back again. Now, this picture was found in the catacombs. And it's really a picture of encouragement. The catacombs were the places where the persecuted Christians lived during the times of persecution, especially during times of Nero, who used to put the Christians up on crosses, pour tar all over them, light them for his beer garden so he could entertain people and drink his beer. That was the kind of man Nero was. But this was a picture of encouragement. They obviously had encouragement from this passage that we're speaking about right here, of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in the fire. Thanks, Alicia. If you could flick it onto the first one here. So we're talking about the call to conformity, the call to worship. We can also talk about the conflict that it brings to the world. Conformity to worship and conformity to the ways of the world, which is basically what the world wants. The world wants us to conform. They want us to be like they are. They don't like people rocking the boat. And they don't like people standing up for God. Believe me, there's a lot of people out there in the workplace that don't like people standing up for God. And so this brings us to the point that there is going to be a time of greater conflict. Even though we have this conflict here for Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and it's isolated for this time back in those days, there is going to be an ultimate conflict when the call to worship will be a worldwide thing, and there will be great persecutions of Christians. If you turn to Daniel chapter 7, verse 21, it says, and he's talking and interpreting a dream, and he says, "As I looked, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom." It's talking about the future, this very passage in Daniel chapter 7, talking about the end times, about the day when Satan will overcome the saints. But I thought the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. That's what Jesus said to Peter. But how come Jesus can say the gates of hell will not prevail against the church, and yet somehow Satan is prevailing against the saints? Why is that happening? Well, the thing is, ultimately, God sees the big picture, and he says, ultimately, there will be a time when the saints will possess the kingdom, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church or his saints. That's the big picture that God has. But there is a time when there will be persecution. There's been times of persecution and waves of persecution through the whole history of the Christian church. But there will be a time when persecution will be greater and on a far greater scale. And we will come back, or the world will come back, or Christians will come back to this story and gain great encouragement, because there is something that God has done in the past, and he has shown us how great he is and how good he is, and that he can overcome ultimately, no matter what the persecution, no matter what we have to go through in this world. Jesus said, "In this world you shall have tribulation, but be of good cheer, for I have overcome the world." In the gospel, in the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So we have these scriptures of encouragement. Even the Gospel of John, in John chapter 15, Jesus says, "When they hate you, remember that they hated me first." Because they hated Jesus, they will hate us. And the world will hate us because they don't know God. They don't know his love, and they persecute us under the power of Satan, because Satan is the prince and the power of this world, and he is in control to a certain extent. God ultimately controls him, but Satan is given certain powers right till the end of time. But they are limited powers, and ultimately God will triumph, and ultimately God will trounce Satan and his kingdom and his efforts to thwart God's kingdom. So the call of worship, the conflict that comes, and talking about the conflict in the future, the world getting angry at non-conformity. Even Nebuchadnezzar didn't like the conformity, the non-conformists of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. Now let's start and go through some of these verses. Verse 4 says, "Then a herald cried out aloud, 'To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the instruments, you will bow down and worship me.'" And if we go to the next one, "And therefore at that time," verse 8, "certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, psaltery, in symphony with all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the gold image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. But there are certain Jews, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. These men, O king, have paid no attention to you. They've paid no due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up.' Then Nebuchadnezzar in rage and fury," which is probably the next one, "Then Nebuchadnezzar in rage and fury gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. So they brought the men before the king, and here we come to the point of the camaraderie of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. They're sticking together in thick and thin, and here they are together, and they brought before King Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar comes and says these fantastic words. "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, that you do not serve my God or worship the gold image which I have set up?" Is it true? Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, that you're not worshipping our gods? Is it true that you're worshipping another God, and because you worship that God, the God that says there shall be no other gods, and you shall not bow down and make any idols or serve the idols, is it true that you serve a different God and you will not serve me and you will not worship me through the image? Is it true? Have you ever had people come to you and ask the question, is it true that you're a Christian? Is it true that, you once were a drunkard and now you're not a drunkard and that something's changed in your life? Is it true that you were a blasphemer and now you're not a blasphemer? Something has changed in your life? Is it true that you go to church on Sunday? Is it true? Is it true you're religious? A bit of a religious nut? Is it true? Is it true that you're a Christian? Is it true? You ever had some of those questions? Is it true? Or is that what you're all about? Going to church? What do you do on church? What do you do at church? What do you do on Sunday? Is it true? Here, Nebuchadnezzar is asking the question, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, you will not worship this God? Is it true? You will not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up. One thing about Nebuchadnezzar is that there's lots of different gods, but he's asking everyone to worship this God. In some ways, he's probably saying, you can worship this God and other gods, but you must conform and worship this God that I've set up. So he still has other gods. And he still respects, in some ways, other gods, but he's saying that everyone must conform and bow down to this particular God that he sets up. And verse 15, "Now if you are ready at the time, you hear the sound of the horn, all the instruments, and worship the image which I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately in the midst of a burning fiery furnace." And then it comes to this point in verse 15. Just read it right there in the last part of that verse. "And who is the God who will deliver you from my hands?" In other words, I'm the all-powerful king. I'm the one that gives life. I'm the one that says who lives and dies. I'm the one who punishes, chops off heads. And I'm the one that sent out this decree for everyone to be burned in the fire. If you do not conform, if you do not obey me and worship this image, who? Who is the God that can defy me? Who is the God that can save you out of my hands? Who? The challenge goes forth. And Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego are somehow encouraged in this, and they're stirred up from the bottom of their heart. And they say, and this is what they say. Listen, really important stuff. "O Nebuchadnezzar," they don't say, have expletives like, "O king, live forever," or anything like that. They get straight into it now. And they say, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." We have no need to answer you in this matter. They're showing a bit of arrogance here. We're standing as God's representatives. We do not need to answer you as far as our worship is concerned about whether we're worshipping other gods or we're worshipping our God, because we will worship our God. We have no need to answer you in this matter. And it gets better. And they say, if that is the case, our God, in other words, if that's the case that you say that we're going to go and get burnt for not worshipping you, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen, but our God is able. Say that with me. Our God is able. Our God is able. Say it. Our God is able. Our God is able to deliver us. He's able to deliver us. Send us to the fire. Send us there. But no matter what, our God is able. He is able to deliver us. There was a confidence, the arrogance in God. Some people don't probably like the word arrogance, but they were arrogant in their worship of God. They were arrogant in their way that they said, we're going to stand. We're going to arrogantly defy your God. We're going to stand with our God. And if we go, we go. But we have one God who is able to deliver. But if not, if God doesn't deliver, what do they say? Let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. Beautiful words. Beautiful words. We know that God is able, but if he doesn't, know this, King Nebuchadnezzar, we will not bow down. We will not worship those gods. And there they stood in comradeship. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednigo. I don't know which one's talking, whether they're all speaking at once or all giving a little bit of their piece, but they stand there defiant, confident in their confession of faith before the king Nebuchadnezzar. This turned the stomach of Nebuchadnezzar. Verse 19 says, then Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury and the expression of his face changed. You know, sort of, just imagine that change in his face, thinking, no, who can defy me? You know, I'm the king. I'm the supreme ruler. No, right, 7 times hotter. We're going to make this furnace 7 times hotter. I don't know how they measured that or how they worked that out, but this was what he said. He spoke and commanded in fury, full of fury. You ever seen a king full of fury? I haven't, but I can imagine it. Having his little tantrums. And he commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valour who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach and Abednigo and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. This is the command of execution we're talking here. Then these men, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednigo, were bound in their coats, trousers, their turbans and their other garments and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's command was so urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach and Abednigo. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednigo, fell down, bound in the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So they got men of valour, tied them up and threw them into the fire. And the men that threw them into the fire got burnt because of the heat and the fiery furnace themselves. So you can imagine them, they're thrown, probably it's a 1, 2, 3, I don't know, it's head and tail, 1, 2, 3 and throw them in. But they landed on the ground, all tied up. And verse 24 says, then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished. So they were thrown in the fire. There's some pause that's happening. Something happens. Then King Nebuchadnezzar is astonished. Why is he astonished? Well, he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, didn't we throw 3 people in the midst of the fire? Hey, come on, guys. Hey, counselors, did you not throw 3 people into the fire? Was it 3 people? How come I can see 4 people in the fire now? How come I can see 4? And he said, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like one of the sons of the gods. That's really the translation that is in the Hebrew, one of the sons of, or in the Aramaic, one of the sons of the gods, rather than the Son of God. Some people talk about the pre-existent Son of God, Jesus Christ being in the fire with them. But really the translation is the sons of gods. You know, someone that's angelic. And later on it talks about the angel that saved them in the midst of the fire. I'm not going to dispute any points there. If you want to debate me after, we can. Whether it's the Son of God or sons of God, the angel, it doesn't matter. God did his work, and God was there in the midst of them, whether through the angel or Jesus, pre-existent Jesus. And there he was, walking around in the midst of the fire. Now, the wonderful thing that comes out in one of the versions of the scriptures, which is the LXX, if I can find it in my verses. LXX was the Greek version of the Old Testament. And in there, it says, I haven't got it here, but it's something like this, that they were in the fire praising God. In other words, they were singing, and they were singing praise in the midst of the fiery furnace. There they were, in the midst of the fiery furnace, walking around. I see 4 men loose, and they're walking around in the midst. Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke to them and said, "Come here, come out, come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach and Abednigo came from the midst of the fire, and the satraps, administrators, governors and the king's councillors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singed, nor were their garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. This was certainly a miracle. None of you can go walking into a huge fiery inferno today, unless God grants you to do that. So this for Nebuchadnezzar and all the people was an amazing and astonishing thing to happen. They defied the God of the image of Nebuchadnezzar. They defied Nebuchadnezzar to his face. But they stand tall as far as God is concerned because they were faithful and they followed after their heart, believing that God was able to deliver them. And even if God wasn't able to deliver them, they weren't going to serve the other gods no matter what. There's wonderful stories that I could multiply about saints on the fire, being burned alive, and wonderful things that have been said from the fire and before the fire and after the fire by Christians or non-Christians that have seen martyrdoms of Christians. We just have to go to the Fox's Book of Martyrs and many of the stories in the history of the church about martyrs before the rulers and people that have persecuted them and killed them. One was Athanasius, who in the time of Constantine, a bit like Shadrach and Meshach and Abednigo, Constantine the emperor is defied by Athanasius. Athanasius is one who believed that Jesus was God's son and that he was God the Son. And someone came to him and said, "Don't you know the emperor, the bishops and the church is against you? The whole world is against you." And he said, "Well, then I'm against the whole world." And then he was martyred for his faith. The boldness of Shadrach, Meshach and Abednigo, the boldness of some of these martyrs in the face of martyrdom is astonishing. And I could give you many quotes and many, many stories which could go on for a long time. Don't get me onto them. But I want to finish with one little story. And it's a story of a martyr from Zimbabwe, actually. Pretty sure it's Zimbabwe. Yeah, Zimbabwe. And I just want to read you the passage that was left on, it was part of his diary, and there was a sheet of paper that was left in part of his belongings after he was martyred for the Lord. And you may have already heard this. It's quite a famous little passage. But this is what he said in his paper. He said, "I am part of the fellowship of the unashamed. The die has been cast. I have stepped over the line. The decision has been made. I'm a disciple of his and I won't look back. Let up, slow down, back away, or be still. My past is redeemed. My present makes sense. My future is secure. I'm done and finished with low living, sight walking, small planning, smooth knees, colourless dreams, tamed visions, mundane talking, cheap living, and dwarfed goals. I no longer need preeminence, prosperity, position, promotions, plaudits, or popularity. I don't have to be right, or first, or tops, or recognised, or praised, or rewarded. I live by faith, lean on his presence, walk by patience, lift by prayer, and labour by his Holy Spirit. My face is set, my gait is fast. My goal is heaven. My road may be narrow, my way rough, my companions few, but my guide is reliable and my mission is clear. I will not be bought, compromised, detoured, lured away, turned back, deluded or delayed. I will not flinch in the face of sacrifice or hesitate in the presence of adversary. I will not negotiate at the table of the enemy, ponder at the pool of popularity, or meander in the maze of mediocrity. I won't give up, shut up, or let up until I have stayed up, stored up, prayed up, paid up, preached up for the cause of Christ. I am a disciple of Jesus. I must give until I drop, preach until all know, and work until he comes.